Our next talk will be by Shannon Abelson, who's joining us from Stanford online, and she'll be talking about informed consent and response.
All right. Thank you, Helen, and thanks everyone. So this project is kind of coming out of a lot of discussions that we've had in the responsible siting group and some things that I've been thinking about. This is an early iteration of the project that I'm hoping will become more of kind of a group collaborative thing. So I don't kind of want this to say a me research project. I want it to be very collaborative. So I'm looking for any and all feedback. Okay, so the main research question that I'm focusing on is a foundational one. So how do we want informed consent to look in our version of responsible citing? And I think this is a really important question for us to answer from a practitioner's standpoint. How do we want to go forward? What kind of assumptions do we want to proceed with? So I'm going to argue here that one of the things that we want to achieve when we're doing responsible citing is agency for all the stakeholders who are involved in the development of a telescope or an observatory. Given that, we should consider adopting a model of informed consent that emphasizes agency and promotes a partnership between stakeholders. This is something that there have been some attempts to do, but not is not the common way to understand informed consent, especially in philosophical literature. So this is kind of a break from traditional notions of informed consent. So in this talk, it's going to be kind of short because I wanted to leave a lot of room for questions. There's going to be a little bit of background. I'm not going to go too far into the background, just some framing stuff. I'm going to talk about informed consent, and then I'm going to talk about this kind of newer model of it. So first off, here are two sites that have been the source of a lot of controversy. The one on the right is probably going to be familiar to everyone. That's the summit of Mauna Kea. And of course, everyone knows about the protests that have been occurring there between mostly indigenous local stakeholders, but also the broader community and the university officials and government officials who are responsible for the observatories. On the left-hand side is a little bit older of a case, but it's still kind of ongoing, which is the Mount Graham International Observatory in Arizona. And you can see the Large Binocular Telescope, but it's one of several observatories. One of them is run by the Vatican, so it's a very international collaboration. And it's run by University of Arizona. So one of the things that I think has surprised a lot of people in the astronomical community is how much very kind of strong pushback these sites have seen. So the top is a quote from Kealoha Pisciota, who is a traditional knowledge keeper and a telescope systems operator. So she kind of has one foot in each stakeholding community in this discussion regarding the 30-meter telescope in Mauna Kea. So she talks about descending from Polynesian navigators, carrying star knowledge, and not initially seeing a conflict between telescopes and the mountain, and only seeing it later during the events, the problems that came from people looting antiquities from the mountain, building bigger telescopes that affected the landscape, and destroying important landmark features. The bottom quote is by Robin Silver, who's a conservation agent for the Center for Biological Diversity in Arizona. And this is concerning Mount Graham. And the Center for Biological Diversity is one of the plaintiffs in a lawsuit trying to stop the observatory. So the effects of this project have gone far beyond what they were supposed to be, what was communicated to local stakeholders. There's the Mount Graham red squirrel is an endangered species that was present on that mountain that is now seemingly suffering population losses. And she notes that, there are a lot of things contributing to that happening, but there is a destructive presence of unnecessary buildings in the heart of its habitat that seems to be an exacerbating factor. So why does the placement of these observatories sometimes encounter this kind of local stakeholder resistance? So consider the kind of broader context surrounding the Mount Graham case. The summit of Mount Graham is the only habitat of the endangered red squirrel. It's not found anywhere else. So if things are built on that summit, they have to be built in such a way to not impact that species or it will be lost. There's also a significant issue of Apache tribal communities not being consulted prior to the construction of the project. In foundational documents, it is identified by local anthropologists that these are sites of significance to the Apache, but they are never consulted. The Zuni, I think, are consulted, but not the Apache. Access to the summit right now is, which is a site of religious significance for the Apache, is restricted by permit that you have to get in advance. And if you don't get the permit, you can be arrested. And a tribal elder was, in fact, arrested on the mountain. There's also the issue of the University of Arizona hiring an outside PR firm to try and affect public sentiment in the area in favor of the project. And that PR firm exercised some pretty heavy-handed rhetoric condemning protests of the mountain observatories. So the prominent reasons for opposition to observatory placement are not because people don't like telescopes, but they're because of perceived effects that these telescopes might have. So these are environmental impacts, conservation, deforestation, pollution threats, cultural, religious, and spiritual desecration for groups that believe a mountaintop or any other environmental feature is of religious significance, and therefore building on it would be a desecration. There are land management disputes. So for some areas, the bureaus of land management do not have a great relationship with local stakeholders in various groups. Energy use, there's a concern about building anything that uses energy. Aesthetic and recreational disturbance, so people who might use mountaintops for recreation like hiking and who might not have as free access might oppose the construction of an observatory, or they might just not like the way telescopes look on top of mountains. There's social and economic impacts. So some communities just don't want to be a hub for science. And there are various reasons why that might be the case. And then there is the issue of colonial histories, especially when it comes to land that was originally taken from indigenous groups. And there's an argument that continuing to build there is a perpetuation of that colonial history. Okay, so that's the background that's constraining a lot of the discussion regarding informed consent and responsible siting. So informed consent is a term that is cross-disciplinary. It's most often seen in medical contexts. So when a doctor goes to perform a procedure, they need to get informed consent from a patient. But it has been more recently invoked as a just standard for land development projects. So the United Nations Manual for Practitioners actually has a significant discussion of the importance of free, prior, and informed consent. So broadly speaking, informed consent is considered given when the consenter has been given access to all relevant information concerning a decision and has affirmed a course of action. But it's often supplemented, and this is where IC becomes FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent, as being freely given, ongoing, explicit, and the consultation occurs before any decision-making by any party. So this idea is that free, prior, and informed consent can be given initially, but taken back. And once it's taken back, you no longer have the free, prior, and informed consent of the person. So it needs to be continuously affirmed. So how free, prior, informed consent and responsible siting is being used. So in a piece arguing for new practices regarding the TMT in Hawaii, a team of Native Hawaiian scholars argued, and this includes Hilding, have argued that developers should immediately halt the 30-meter telescope progress and work with Native Hawaiian cultural knowledge holders to restart dialogue with the goal of obtaining informed consent. So right from the outset, they think the entire project to date has been illicit because it never had informed consent. They say construction cannot proceed without consent from Native Hawaiians. The astronomical community must be willing to accept that a no-deal outcome may ultimately be requested by Native Hawaiians or the state of Hawaii. Native Hawaiian cultural knowledge holders, including those not affiliated with the fields of astronomy, must consent, not merely to be consultants to further development. Inherent in the consent process is the ability to lead in decision-making. And those last couple sentences, I think, are extremely important because they go beyond what is often assumed is the minimum threshold in informed consent. And they start talking about participation in the decision-making process, as opposed to just being consulted and then the consultant moves on. So in a 2007 account of informed consent, Neil Manson and Honora O'Neill try to develop a different model of informed consent. I'm not going to get too much into their model because I think there are still some problems with their model, but they do have a lengthy discussion of what they see are the problems with the received view of informed consent that is used in most healthcare settings. And they categorize that problem as a disproportionate focus on respect for autonomy. So this practice is inherently top-down. The information is conveyed from an expert source in the medical context, the doctor or the nurse, who is in a privileged epistemic position, and consent is sought from the receiver of this information, the patient, who is considered in an impoverished epistemic position. The container metaphor is what they call this situation, where the communicator is a conduit of information and the consenting party is a largely passive container who just takes the information and now it's contained with them. This approach is often measured against whether the autonomy of the consenter has been respected and preserved, so they weren't manipulated or deceived in any way, there were no omissions. But that's still a largely passive role to the consenter. They just receive and go, okay, or not. So I think Manson and O'Neill are largely right that the container model is problematic because it focuses on autonomy. But I think the reason why is slightly different than the one that they outline. Autonomy is a rather conservative, and in this sense I mean minimal, threshold. I can preserve someone's autonomy, especially if I'm a Kantian, by being honest with them. I don't lie to them, I don't treat them as a mere means, but that doesn't automatically mean I have allowed them the space to act in accordance with that autonomy. There might be a lot of other adjoining constraints on whether or not they can act on that autonomy. I think we should be focusing on informed consent as a way to preserve agency as opposed to just merely autonomy. So autonomy is most commonly understood as just self-governance. So an agent like myself is able to make decisions and form opinions without external manipulation. I've taken whatever information I need, I think about it, come up with my reasons, and I decide whatever my opinion is going to be. Trouble is, this is kind of a solipsistic and episodic feature. It's focused on the state of an individual agent. This is kind of fine, or at least on the surface fine, in contexts where an agent is seeking free and prior informed consent to do something to another agent. So if a doctor is seeking permission to perform a procedure on a patient, it's not a problem that the self-governance of that agent is something internal to them. That seems natural. But this might make autonomy poorly suited for discussions that concern the use of land, which is external to the agent. So it's not just a one-to-one conversation between the person seeking consent or the agency or entity seeking consent and the consenter. There's this extra dimension of its consent with respect to doing something to an external body like land. So what's at issue for us is how diverse stakeholders with differing levels of power can justly interact with respect to land development. That means that we need a foundational concept for free and prior informed consent that captures the rights agents have to act in environments. So here's the upshot. I think autonomy doesn't serve that role, but agency might. So consider the document that I mentioned earlier, the United Nations document on free, prior, informed consent for project practitioners with respect to land development. Now, they're not talking specifically about astronomy, they're talking about all kinds of land development projects, but they're particularly sensitive to the concerns that marginalized groups have raised, in particular, indigenous stakeholders. So they say the highest level of participation is when local stakeholders have control over decision-making and resources, where they partner with development agencies to design, plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate programs, and when the local communities reserve the right to withhold consent for a project. Free, prior, and informed consent ensures that the relationship between the development agency and a local community is one of the partnership. So that's a really strong statement about what it should look like when we are thinking about building something on land and we are talking to people who live there. So a true partnership requires all participants to have agency. This is the power not only to self-govern, but to act in the world according to that self-governance. So that dimension that was missing from autonomy, where I might treat somebody as if they are self-governing, but that doesn't automatically mean they have the power to exercise that. This adds that extra ingredient. So I think this is the model of free, prior, and informed consent we should aspire to in responsible siting. And I am completely aware that this is a really high bar. Astronomers and telescope operators, though, they get to exercise this right when they promote the value of science for all and are free to pursue projects that alter physical landscapes in the pursuit of that value. So probably everyone in this room, myself included, think building telescopes is a good thing and we should continue to do it. And there are very few fetters, besides monetarily, on our ability to do that. We know the procedures that we have to go through, and we can, if we decide we want to do something, as long as we can secure the funding for it and the permissions from the relevant agencies, that option is open. But local stakeholders should also be afforded the same space to advocate for the value of cultural, spiritual, and environmental preservation of the same landscapes. And I think one of the things that has come out in a lot of the literature regarding responsible siting is that many local stakeholding groups do not feel that they have the same freedom to pursue those avenues that those in the role of the developers have. So in a partnership model of free, prior, and informed consent, we're prioritizing the agency of all involved stakeholders, not just those who are involved in the proactive development of the telescope, but anybody who might be affected, however minimally, even if it's just the fact that they live in the same zip code, but otherwise have no interest in a mountain. So partnership is also a really malleable relationship, which is, I think, an advantage here. So one of the things that you might immediately wonder is what happens when people don't want a telescope, like in the Mount Graham case and like in the case of Mauna Kea. What does that mean for a partnership model of free, prior, and informed consent? Well, it means that sometimes local stakeholders might refuse to consent to a project. In that case, a true partnership is not possible for a site's development and should be a disqualifying factor. I stopped short of saying that means you should not build a telescope. I'm saying disqualifying factor here, which is a little weaker. But I think, it's still a pretty strong reason to consider a different site not being able to achieve this partnership with local stakeholders. But there's a wide range of reactions that communities might have to the building of telescopes that don't just, include yes or no. There's a spectrum. So some local stakeholders might seek fair representation and compensation for the use of ceded lands, but they're not interested in contributing to the operations. They just want to be compensated for the use of the land, maybe the loss of the land for year-round practices of a certain sort. So recent attempts to incorporate indigenous knowledge, for example, in educational and scientific programs for observatories can be really fruitful, but they can also be read as appropriating and disingenuous when they're not wanted by those groups. So the solution to that is to have a conversation with those groups, an ongoing conversation to kind of suss out how much involvement local stakeholders want to have in a site. And it might be the case that they want to be involved in the decision making, but they don't want to be administrators of the sites. And I think we have terminology to describe this kind of situation of kind of like a silent partnership where a stakeholder or set of stakeholders contribute in a way that's like enabling. They give permission. Maybe they are more involved in the kind of early development process, but kind of take a step back later and don't remain active participants going forward. So these are all possible configurations of participation when it comes to responsible siting. And I think starting to talk about this in terms of the agency of individual stakeholding groups allows us to start conceiving of these relationships in this spectrum of terms, rather than just did I treat these local stakeholders with autonomy? Well, I proposed this telescope project. I did some listening sessions. I made all the information available. I did an environmental impact assessment and made that available. And now I'm going to build the thing because nobody objected. The reality is that that process is not always accessible to all local stakeholders. So putting the requirement in terms of a partnership creates an extra set of responsibilities on the part of developers to constantly seek out this discussion with local stakeholders in pursuit of this kind of partnership. Okay, thanks.
Okay, maybe we can start with in-person people questions, and then I can do the Zoom question.
Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, just project.
I will project. So it's a great talk. I guess I wanted to ask about yet maybe a third level where you engage with the stakeholders to create something that's new from the perspective of both the astronomers and the local stakeholders. I'll give you an example. We went to Tanzania to speak with people about potentially putting a telescope in Tanzania. And when we climbed up to a higher elevation, we gave a demonstration of a star party to the local guide. And they said, wow, we've never even thought of doing something like this before. And that could augment their financial investment into it, as well as, let's say, putting a visitor center or things like this. So it's by working together that you can build something, I think, that goes beyond what the astronomers are thinking and what some of the local stakeholders are thinking. And that's where this agency and partnership comes in. I think that something based on that could really have legs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think, yeah, a lot of this conversation, I think sometimes is cast in terms of what responsibilities astronomers and anybody in the developing side of a project have with respect to local stakeholders without thinking about the fact that the contribution of the local stakeholders can positively shape the science in so many ways and vice versa. So having this kind of more reciprocal partnership relationship does, I think, create the most fertile ground for building new things, coming up with new ideas and new concepts.
Okay, Adrian, I see your hand next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I had one question about when you say that the local communities must consent. How should I imagine this consent? Is this what you mean? Is this really individual consent from basically every person that has access or lives there? Or do you use some kind of, I don't know, sort of organizational structures, and then in the end you have, I don't know, kind of a board, a subgroup, a committee, a representation that gives you the consent instead of all the individuals? Can you say a bit more about this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's certainly not intended to be every individual like person of voting age in a zip code related to a building project. That would be an insurmountable task, and I also think would probably annoy most local stakeholders. They don't really need to weigh in. It's going to be interest groups, probably shaped by their particular set of concerns. Now, one thing that I think about I don't think this extends to all kinds of solicited informed consent or free, prior, and informed consent from local stakeholders with respect to projects, but at least in these kinds of cases, in the case of developing observatories, the groups that are going to have an interest in discussing how a project will go forward are already kind of formed, and we know who these kind of groups are for the most part. They're going to be environmental groups. They're going to be local economic groups. They're going to be indigenous groups, if there are any groups still around that have indigenous ties to the land. They're going to be maybe local Audubon societies, conservation societies. These groups are already kind of either formally there or they naturally form around an issue. But it's those groups. And usually there's already somebody who speaks for them. So in the case of indigenous groups, there's a tribal elder. So there is a point of contact already there. But I think it's also important to keep open the idea that we might be not aware of all the local stakeholding interest groups that might want to weigh in on a project. So I think it's also important to continue some of the practices that are already in existence, like opening up sessions for public comment and maybe running ads on like local radio or TV or a podcast, you know, saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this kind of thing, trying to reach as many people as possible, because what we're trying to avoid is a situation later where there's somebody who wasn't consulted that we definitely would have wanted to consult.
Excellent, thank you.
Interesting question. Oh, okay, let's go, Peter.
In nuclear waste siting, there's been a big change from that really resulted from the fact that, unlike the earlier nuclear projects, nuclear waste sites that did not have consent were blocked, and they, after spending vast amounts of money, numerous states and numerous specific sites, and not only in the United States, but the Swedish government fell twice over this issue. It's been a big issue around the world. And they talk about consent-based siting. So it's built into the sort of the program now, and different countries have had different ways of approaching this. But it might be interesting to explore some of the dynamics about in that area, not nuclear waste. Similar, it's just that but the fact of consent to site has been something that's been now recognized by the Department of Energy. They say, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says you can't put things where people don't want them. So it's I think that, and there have been some successful models of this, for instance, in Sweden, but elsewhere as well. So it just might be an interesting point of comparison.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Peter. That's a great suggestion. I have been looking at kind of related discussions in like green energy development. So like building wind turbine farms, and solar panel arrays. And also I've been looking at parallel discussions that are going on in like interest in building spaceports, which can have really disruptive environmental consequences and push back on that. So yeah, there are a lot of related cases, and the nuclear waste one is another really good one that I'll look at. Thanks.
Okay, I think we should take one more.
Nurali.
Yeah, so Nurali, if you want to go ahead.
Hello, this is Jivaji from Tanzania. I'd like to say a few comments about this issue. We've been talking with Shep and his team about how to be very careful about the upcoming, or at least the planned telescope on Kilimanjaro. One of the main points which we have an advantage of about is that the site that we are considering is a site where there is no habitation, there is no vegetation, there is no, maybe there will be some ecological, fauna, and so for such an area, there is no direct day-to-day involvement of villagers there. We have been pointed to perhaps one site where it is like a traditional site where they bury or something like that, but that's not on the actual site where we are planning to have the telescope. And one of the initial concerns was that people thought we were going to go up to the peak, which is also of international concern, which we already knew about, and we have said that no, we are not going to the peak. We are only on the saddle, which is quite an open area, almost the desert type of condition, rocky, like a flat area, and very ideal for such work actually. So in terms of the villages' involvement, it is more like the surrounding or the lower level villagers who are involved, and that is where they will be involved in while taking up our materials and day-to-day and regular traffic, let's say, during the operation of the telescope. So that's where the villagers would be involved. And one other thing that is different for Kilimanjaro is that the villages there have been exposed to a Western development since for the past, since Kilimanjaro was so-called discovered, by the Western world, So since that time, the Europeans have settled there, and a lot of this Chaga community which live there are modernized and really up to the grandparents, great-grandparents level, are relatively receptive about modernization. So it's more about benefiting, like the villagers. If we are going to involve villagers themselves, it's more like benefiting, like how much will the villagers benefit? What kind of, maybe perhaps schools or water or such facilities, and also involving. I hope that if we can offer employment, or at least opportunities for training and education, etc. Especially in our field, that will be very attractive. So that's one of the areas where we feel that we may have more advantage. And I'm worried that if we are going to make a big issue out of this, people we can take advantage, especially in a country like Tanzania, where we are sort of centrally governed. A lot of control is by the government, and government goes up to the village level. So there's a local government, then they have a lot of power, although they are village elders, but there will be a local government also, which we will have to be involving them also. So I hope that what I would like to know is what kind of issues can we, perhaps when we are talking with them, how can we find out without alerting them too much about all our concerns directly, how we can discern from them their concerns. What kind of questions can we ask so that we can be alerted to their concern relatively early, so that we can address them when we now face them second or third time. So that might be a useful questionnaire to prepare if we are going to prepare something in preparation. In fact, we are going to have a stakeholders meeting where we are going to involve some of the what do you call these porters and the people who are actually using Kilimanjaro as an economic activity, and the environmentalists also. So we hope that we'll have those people involved. But from the villages' point of view, if we can have some questionnaire or something like that, which we can use, or we can judge from general questions relatively early their concerns. That's something that would be useful. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to say, but I know that we're running up on time. So maybe this is a discussion we could also kind of have after this and like on a longer basis. But
okay.
Just a few things that I'll say. First off, yeah, certainly places that don't have a lot of vegetation, not a lot of stuff alive, reduce some of the environmental concerns, but not all. So one of the other things that I work on are like space ethics. And there are still environmental concerns that come into play when you're talking about a celestial body like the moon or Mars, where nothing lives on it. There are still stakeholders who consider it to have environmental significance. In terms of the questionnaire, I think there are certainly, general questions that you can ask to kind of elicit what the primary concerns are for anyone about a land development project. I do want to be careful about not like this is there's a line between omission and kind of not showing all of your cards on the table. I think morally speaking, it's okay to not put maybe all of your cards on the table, but we certainly want to be forthright with local stakeholders about what a project might involve for their communities. But that includes advertising all of the pluses of the project as well. So it doesn't we don't have to go in and kind of be like, here are all the negative things that this might do. How do you feel about that? You can paint a much more neutral picture and kind of see what people's feelings are about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Shannon.
Thanks, everyone.